These files were never meant to be public, but someone reopened them. This is the Dark Bureau. Every day, more than $5 trillion flows silently through the global digital financial infrastructure, a blend of high-frequency trades, cross-border wiring, and everyday commerce. This vast ocean of currency moves by protocol and code, protected by layers of permissions and oversight. For most, it is as reliable as sunrise. But beneath this surface, in the tiny spaces between thousands of legitimate transactions, traces of money slip away. These are losses without warning. No alarms, no intruder on camera, no obvious breach. Just a red entry in an audit log, and funds vanished into the ether. For international businesses, this is often written off as the cost of doing business. A few unexplained gaps chalked up to clerical error or miscommunication. Yet these quiet losses mask a larger reality. In the space of minutes, funds once destined for a Californian supplier reroute to a nondescript account in Lagos. Payrolls delayed, projects stalled, trust eroded. The contradiction cannot be ignored. How do world-class security systems, with millions invested in technology and compliance, miss the crucial moment when a plain-looking email turns into orchestrated theft? The answer lies in the connections, where human relationships, trust, and digital vulnerabilities intersect. This episode uncovers one of the most audacious and rapidly evolving forms of global financial crime, the business email compromise. At its heart, BEIS is not about technology alone. It relies on exploiting the predictability of organizations, knowing how invoices are approved, where authority sits, and who trusts whom. What first appears as a routine office message often forms the initial link in a global chain. From a board meeting in Frankfurt to a shipping depot in Singapore, the same script plays out. Requests for payment arrive from familiar names, with signatures and details indistinguishable from genuine correspondence. Yet behind the scenes, criminal syndicates operate a sophisticated apparatus, manipulating digital identities and rewriting how money journeys from sender to receiver. Inside the incident response teams and forensic labs tasked with picking up the pieces, the reality is grimmer than the public understands. Analysts cross-reference metadata, trace logins through layers of proxies, and find entire trails returning no actionable lead. The attack is designed for ephemerality. Every login laundered through anonymizing servers, each withdrawal auto-transferred to the next account. Physical borders mean little. One payment can cross 3 countries before its first daylight business hour. Patterns emerge only after months of casework. Shipment instructions diverted at the last minute. Internal communications perfectly mimicked. High-value transactions rerouted seconds before closure. And directors impersonated with astonishing accuracy. What investigators find is that the actors behind these operations are not isolated hackers, but nodes in transnational networks, each specializing in a particular element of attack. The ecosystem is dynamic and multi-layered. Some nodes focus on social engineering, spending weeks building rapport with targets. Others forge documents, purchase orders, banking instructions, or even notarized power of attorney letters. Some coordinate networks of money mules, opening new accounts for each job, then shutting them before the funds can be traced. Within days, an account might have received and dispersed hundreds of thousands of dollars, all under the guise of regular business activity. The digital laundering exploits blind spots in anti-money laundering regimes and financial regulations, manipulating the delay between transaction flagging and notice. No single syndicate controls the network entirely, but competition and collaboration coexist. Information, stolen credentials, and trusted supplier lists are traded, sold, and sometimes shared. For law enforcement and the financial sector, chasing this web is a challenge in adaptation. Traditional responses, freezing suspect accounts, hunting for obvious mistakes, are less effective when each attack node functions independently and when compromise can shift geopolitically overnight. The consequence is a global arms race between law enforcement, who operate within the boundaries of jurisdiction and political constraint, and loosely affiliated criminals who stand ready to shift tactics and territory at the first sign of heat. Major task forces, sometimes ad hoc, sometimes organised through Interpol, Europol, or regional cybercrime units, struggle to keep pace. Extradition requests multiply, multinational legal procedures drag, and the attackers exploit every day of delay to pivot or vanish. The transformation of BEC from amateur phishing to precision-targeted corporate fraud is relatively recent, yet its rise was years in the making. In the early 2000s, organisations viewed email fraud as little more than a digital nuisance. Bad grammar, blunt requests for help, crude deceptions easily flagged by even inexperienced staff. This changed almost overnight when syndicate bosses in West Africa, frustrated with diminishing returns from older scams, began to recruit young specialists, graduates in IT, finance, business, and language studies. A new playbook was written. No longer dependent on mass spam, these groups now sought out specific company structures, identifying who in a procurement team approved invoices, who had the authority to override banking instructions, and even the quirks of signature lines. Internal recruitment was organised, promising new hires were meticulously trained, tested for critical thinking, and given custom software to automate attacks. Some syndicates invested in malware development, building email spoofing infrastructure to outpace evolving corporate controls. Corporations, meanwhile, implemented training modules and installed defensive tools. But the attackers always seemed a step ahead, deploying polymorphic messages, anticipating policy updates, and exploiting business processes that couldn't simply be locked behind a firewall. Each successful attack prompted not only news stories and added vigilance, but a new wave of imitation. The phenomenon became self-propagating. Criminals studied law enforcement techniques and began to adjust operational security. Multi-layered cell structures meant that even if a mule or low-level operative was caught, little real intelligence about the larger network made its way out. As attacks increased in both scale and complexity, the costs grew, not just in financial loss, but in reputational damage, regulatory suspicion, and risk to the basic trust that underpins operations at multinational firms. A watershed moment in the battle against BEC came not in a dramatic sting or international raid, but in the calm of a Lagos courtroom. Prosecutors working in coordination with European partners presented evidence from a breakthrough. Laptops and phones seized during a coordinated operation. The data inside revealed the sophistication of the operation. Rather than a loose band of opportunists, this was an organisation structured with business-like rigour. Mid-level lieutenants oversaw recruitment, performance metrics tracked who generated the most profit, and detailed manuals outlined tactics and fallback procedures. The court documents showed how discipline was maintained inside the network. Fines imposed for sloppy mistakes, training sessions set for underperforming subgroups, and blacklists imposed on leaky operators. The exposure forced not just the Nigerian judiciary, but law enforcement agencies from 5 continents to confront the scale and professionalism of what they faced. Media coverage transformed the episode from a local case to a global wake-up call. Financial regulators and corporate headquarters scrambled to understand where their own procedures had failed. Conferences brought together compliance officers, IT directors, and legal teams. The joint realization was not comforting. For every syndicate put on trial, dozens more adapted. Communication among criminals shifted to encrypted channels. Dark web forums lit up with chatter about new methods, and operations splintered into even more decentralized, difficult-to-track clusters. Analysts observed that syndicates responded to law enforcement just as agile corporations respond to competitors, by innovating faster and breaking up operations into cells that could not bring the whole down if uncovered. The consequences followed swiftly. The regulatory response was sweeping. Governments issued urgent new guidelines on invoice verification. Banks were pressed to increase back-office transaction monitoring, and whistleblower protections were strengthened for employees reporting suspicious payments. Payouts above certain thresholds were subjected to stringent multi-step verification. Suspicious transactions triggered international alerts, and financial institutions invested billions in upgrading systems for pattern recognition, anomaly detection, and cross-border data sharing. But the arms race was not one-sided. Syndicates quickly adopted AI-powered tools of their own. Machine learning to generate pitch-perfect emails, linguistic modelling to mimic the writing style of senior executives, and even social media mining to anticipate key personnel absences or role changes. New malware strains tested the latest defences, while zero-day vulnerabilities were quietly traded on dark markets to be exploited before patches could be delivered. A new kind of institutional response was required, one that departed from the legacy of static defences and siloed investigations. Task forces grew more fluid, blending public and private intelligence. Some companies banded together for collective threat sharing, pooling incident data to create rapid response signals that could be exchanged globally. At the same time, legal departments and insurers debated liability and risk, forcing boards to revisit business continuity strategies and redefine accountability for losses. In the courts, high-profile cases brought public scrutiny to the failure of due diligence, the adequacy of compliance programs, and, occasionally, the question of whether leadership could have done more. For employees victimised by perfectly crafted fraudulent requests, the fallout ranged from internal disciplinary proceedings to career-ending consequences, and in the worst cases, emotional trauma from involvement in multi-million-dollar losses. On the structural level, the global response to BEC fraud altered the architecture of commerce. Automated anti-fraud checks became embedded not only in banking apps, but in everyday procurement systems. Risk management was elevated from a technical footnote to an executive priority, with annual training and real-time simulation drills. Yet in parallel, the criminal syndicates continued to fragment and innovate. Some moved away from targeting Fortune 500 companies, focusing instead on smaller suppliers, NGOs, and public institutions with less robust cyber defences. Attackers diversified, launching parallel schemes in real estate transactions, healthcare payments, and even government contracting. Anywhere systemic trust could be exploited. The risks became more democratised, touching not just the mega corporation, but the secondary supplier, the freight forwarder, the local school. The cycle is self-reinforcing. For every new regulation, a new loophole emerges. Every arrest, a new operational playbook is written. What was once confined to the internet cafes of West Africa now spreads across continents, accelerated by remote work, outsourced business processes, and increasingly interconnected global markets. Each adaptation from both sides leaves lasting changes, a new tool, a tighter rule, a more skeptical employee. Yet there is no finish line, only continual adaptation. It is a battle fought less in cinematic raids and more in everyday vigilance, changing policies, and sometimes in difficult conversations between auditor and executive, employee and supervisor, customer and supplier. Today, these ghostly manipulations in the fibre challenge the very future of trust in global commerce. Anti-fraud frameworks double as improvisational battlegrounds, with algorithms, analysts, and AI-driven defences under near constant siege. Every success, no matter how small, is matched by a corresponding evolution from adversaries. The consequences echo not just in quarterly losses, but in the policies and relationships that underpin global trade. For a business leader, the real impact of BEC is not just the money gone, but the necessity to reimagine trust and accountability in an era when digital shadows outpace the tools meant to catch them. As the world adapts, so too does the adversary. With each new ghost in the fibre, the stakes for the future of commerce, indeed for the nature of trust itself, rise ever higher.